Hi YouTube, I'm Jack, a junior doctor working in London. If you're taking a year out of training, or an F3 year, then most junior doctors will either do locum and bank shifts, or they'll work a clinical fellow job, which includes teaching fellows and research fellows. Those are the options that I considered in my year out, and in this video I'll be explaining what they are, the pros and cons of each, and how to organise them. I'll use my own experience as an example. Of course, there are other options like working abroad or doing something not related to medicine, so don't forget those. However, they're beyond the scope of this video. This video is not sponsored, so let's go. Locum and bank shifts are essentially rota gaps that need to be filled. They are then offered usually at a higher rate than for somebody who's working there on a fixed contract. The difference between a locum and a bank shift is that the locum is employed by a locum agency, which is an organisation separate to the hospital, and bank shifts are organised by the hospital themselves. With locums, if you join an agency, you can work in different hospitals, whereas with a bank, you can only work in the hospital that you're a member of. So to work in many hospitals, you have to join many banks. Generally speaking, shifts usually go out to the hospital bank before they go out to the locum agency. Why do them? There are two main reasons. Firstly is the pay. So for locum and bank shifts, you normally get paid significantly higher than for a fixed contract, such as when you're on a training job. I think locum shifts are typically better paid than bank shifts, but that can also vary by hospital. The other reason to do these shifts is for flexibility, because you can essentially pick which shifts you want to work, which means that if you need days off, then you just don't take any shifts. That's good if you want to make family events like weddings, etc., or even do a serious hobby on the side. Bear in mind, you can also get longer term locums where you work several weeks or months at an escalated rate. However, these are harder to come by and tend to get taken up quite quickly. So an important thing to note is that bank shifts in London are limited in their pay by the London cap. This essentially stops you being paid for bank shifts above a certain level, and that's significantly lower than in hospitals outside of London. Another disadvantage to locum and bank shifts is that they are typically the shifts that nobody wants to do, so they end up being out of hours, such as at weekends or at night time. A big disadvantage with these shifts, if you do them in a hospital you've never been to before, is that you don't know the team as well. So that means that everything you do feels like pure service provision rather than any training, and you won't get included in things like team socials if that's something that's important to you. Also, for this reason, there'll be fewer opportunities for you to do portfolio building activities, although it's not impossible. Another disadvantage is that shifts can be cancelled at fairly short notice, which means that your stream of income is not particularly secure. Also, you need to be quite organised with your finances and dealing with HMRC, especially if you're on more than one hospital, bank or locum agency. You also won't be earning any NHS pension contributions when working as a locum typically. To organise locums, you contact a locum agency. This video is not sponsored, so I can't recommend any in particular. I would recommend joining more than one because sometimes they offer different rates, and that way you get to pick the higher rate. When you join the agency, you can then tell them which locations you prefer to work in, which rates you will accept, and if there's any type of shift like night shifts or weekends that you will or won't do. After that, if any opportunities come up, they'll let you know. To organise hospital bank shifts, the easiest way to get onto the bank is to join the bank for the hospital that you're currently working at, because you'll already have done the paperwork and the occupational health checks. So for them, you just have to contact the administrator responsible and they'll set you up with another contract. As I've said, to work in multiple hospital banks, you have to join each of the banks, and to do that, you would apply to them with your CV, for example. Nowadays, many hospital banks use apps such as Locum's Nest or Patchwork, and you can apply through there by uploading your documents. A clinical fellow is a full-time, non-training job in a particular department in a hospital, typically of 6 or more months duration. For example, I did a junior clinical fellow in intensive care for 6 months. The clinical fellow jobs can also have a teaching or research flavour to them, and you might see these advertised as teaching fellows or research fellows. For those, part of your time is allocated for teaching activities or research, and that could be anywhere from 1 or more days of your week. However, you can almost certainly expect to be part of the on-call rota for the specialty that you've joined. One of the reasons to do a clinical fellow job is that you have a secure salary for a period of time, and also during that you'll contribute to the NHS pension. The other reason is to experience a specialty that you might want to do, or as in my case, you wanted to apply for ENT ST3, and doing an intensive care rotation gives you points on that application. By joining the specialty, you have the added benefit of being able to meet some trainees already in that specialty, and it's also easier to do projects that can boost your points for application. I would say another big benefit of clinical fellow jobs is that you're more part of the team, and it's a lot better going to work where you actually know the team and you know where things are, and will get invited to things like social events. For where I did my clinical fellow, a lot of the junior doctors still meet up even though most of us have left, which can be quite good if you've just moved to a location and don't know many people. One of the main disadvantages is that you're paid lower per hour than if you did locum shifts, and actually the pay rate can vary between clinical fellow jobs, so sometimes you can be paid significantly lower. Also, as these are typically full-time, it's a less flexible job because you'll still need to request leave and time these around on calls. When you're working, it can also still feel like service provision because to some extent you are there to do that, although I would argue that locum or bank shifts are more about service provision than clinical fellow jobs. To apply for clinical fellow jobs, you look on the Track Jobs or NHS Jobs websites, which I've linked down below in the description. All clinical fellow jobs need to be advertised on these websites, so that's where you'll see all the listings. I recommend that you apply to several of these. I think I applied to about 15 or so, because they can be quite competitive in some areas. For the application, you fill in quite a long form, and in that usually you put in your previous teaching experience, your research and quality improvement experience as well. And then you might get selected for interview. Now the interview is slightly different to specialty interviews because they can ask you why you chose that hospital and why you chose that specialty. So I'd say it's worth doing a bit of research about that department and what their strengths are, and having something to say when they ask you that. The other thing they're quite likely to ask is how you'd manage an emergency in that specialty. So get used to answering those kinds of questions. You can refer to my video about answering clinical scenario questions for core surgical training. The last thing you should note is that the further away a hospital is from the centre of a big city, the more likely it is that there are better benefits, such as having dedicated time for teaching or quality improvement. My biggest piece of advice about doing locum or bank shifts or a clinical fellow job is whichever you pick, you're very clear and deliberate with what you want to get out of them. So if you're saving money for a house deposit, or you want to be able to work very flexibly and either holiday or take on a major hobby, then locuming or doing bank shifts is probably better. However, if you want to try out a specialty or get points for your applications and meet other trainees who are willing to help you with those applications, then a clinical fellow job might be better for you. Leave any questions in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.